there is no way you can build wealth if your time is tied to your money. So you need to detach your time from the money you earn.
Thank you for checking out Real Talk Personal Finance. Shit's about to get real. Cash Flow King with you today. And in today's episode, we have Why Smart People Still Lose the Money Game featuring Alex Artenie. Before we bring him into the show, just a couple of quick announcements. As always, first of all, thank you for taking the time to listen to the Real Talk Personal Finance podcast. We have taken your feedback into consideration, and as my goal was going into the beginning of 2026 this year, was to have more guests on the show. And as part of that, I have been more open and receptive to folks when they reach out to the show and would like to come on for a particular topic, whether they have a book or a course or just want to talk shop about personal finance. So in an effort to continue that trend, we have with us here today Alex Artenie, who has a book, and surprisingly a little bit different than a lot of books that are out there. This book is actually completely free. So we're not here to sell you anything. He's not here to sell you anything today. The name of the book is The Money Game, and it is the simple psychology to transform your money mindset, build confidence, and create freedom. Without further ado, please welcome to the show our next guest and newest premium subscriber, Alex Artenie. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you, Cashflow Thing. It's really nice being here.
Thank you for taking the time. So I think our title of the show, Why Smart People Still Lose the Money Game, is probably going to entice a lot of people to want to listen to today's show. I think most of us out there would consider ourselves fairly intelligent individuals and smart people, but yet it seems like a lot of people still struggle with their personal finances. So kick it off for us. What are you seeing people doing that they're still kind of not really winning, if you will, when it comes to money and personal finance?
Yeah, in my opinion, that's because the money game is actually not an intelligence game. It's more an emotional game. And being smart mathematically, is not the same as being smart with your emotions. So in my book, I describe the 6 inner drivers. That's how I call them. And these are basically the emotions that drive your financial behavior without you even realizing that. So I could start maybe with fear. So that's one of the key emotional drivers that we all have inside of us. And the problem with that is that it keeps you stuck. Yeah. So if you don't eliminate fear, you will never move. So in order to do that, you need to move forward in small and controlled steps. And the more you move, the more comfortable you will be to make the next step, and so on.
So what would be an example? Let's touch on that for a minute here. So somebody that is afraid of what exactly?
Most often it's fear of having a loss. And people are loss avert. So that means the pain for experiencing a loss is greater than the joy for experiencing a gain. I can bring you an example of a colleague of mine who actually got stuck. So he invested $1,000 in the stock market in some random stocks without too much research. It happens that he lost everything, because he sold in an opportune event. And after that, he never invested again. But you know what happened? The market actually goes up. Yeah. So even the stocks that he was invested in, they also went up. But he lost that opportunity because he was afraid to ever invest again.
So he invested some money into a stock. The stock starts to go down. He's afraid that it's likely going to continue to go down. And in order to not see his investment go to zero, he sold at presumably a significant loss, locked it in, and then was afraid to ever invest again, pretty much, right?
Exactly, and I believe already 10 years passed since then, and he didn't touch the stock market ever again.
He needs to read your book.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so people are afraid, and I can attest to that. Working in financial services for as long as I have, we've even seen that with clients. And I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole or off on a tangent here, but there are products out there, financial products out there, that are designed to, for lack of a better phrase, play to the fear that some people may have. And I guess I'll give a quick example of this. You have sort of traditional financial public markets, right? People can invest in the stock market, for example, but they may experience something similar to what Alex's colleague went through with, essentially selling in an opportune time, like you mentioned, and kind of that, loss aversion. So there are products out there where people will put money into them, and they, instead of going to cash or earning something where they're getting a very, very low return, maybe they don't want to do that, but maybe they are still fearful enough where they don't want to put their money into something that's completely variable and has the risk of loss. So there are products out there that are designed to essentially protect them from some, or in some cases, either a portion of or all of the downside. The trade-off to that, though, is there's often a limitation on what type of return they can earn on the upside. But this is an issue, and the reason I bring this up is an issue, I think, with a lot of people in general, which speaks to why these products exist in the first place. And this by no means is a recommendation for anybody to do anything, including to go out and look for something like that. But I just wanted to highlight the fact that those products do exist. And I think the underlying reason why they exist speaks to what Alex just kind of mentioned for us, which is people being fearful and potentially not fully understanding how investing works over long periods of time. So I'll go ahead and pause there and turn it back over to Alex, but I just wanted to add that in there because that is something that we see, and I just kind of wanted to further validate what he mentioned.
Yeah, thank you, Cashflow King. So the next emotion as a financial driver that I often see is hope. So I see hope as a denial, and I have other buddies of mine who were on the opposite of the spectrum. So they invested in something and then they were waiting for years for the investment to recover. I even had some guys who started their own business and it didn't work at all, but they kept in for years, yeah, without closing the business and starting for something else. Yeah. So in my book, there is a concept that I describe, which I call the optimism quadrant. So in order to not be a victim of hope as denial, we should be optimistic, yeah, but optimism without clear next moves becomes denial, yeah. So we need to be optimistic, but we should clearly know what are our next steps and when should we stop.
So would it be safe to say, going off of that example of somebody starting a business, that they say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and start this business, but I'm going to give myself X amount of time to see if this thing actually works. And if it does, great, we continue. But if it doesn't, instead of continuing to throw good money after bad at that point, we just need to learn how to cut our losses and move on to something else. Is that pretty much what that would be?
Yes, exactly. I believe they call it pivoting in jargon.
Okay, pivoting. All right. But for the listeners here, if they're thinking about this, and here's actually, well, I haven't done a show publicly about this yet. I think I am, for all of our premium subscribers, I think I am going to do a really catchy show. In fact, I already have a title for it, but it starts off with Cashflow King Gets Shit Canned. And we'll save that for a premium episode, and we won't spend too much time on that today. But I actually have started looking at franchises, for example, as part of pivoting in my next step. Or do I want to stay in financial services? And we can dig into that at a later time. But I guess the reason I bring that up here is, okay, well, let's say I did find a franchise that I was interested in, or maybe let's say I started a small business from scratch. How does one think about parameters and quantify where do you draw the line so that you're not crossing it and just being hopeful forever? What type of things would people be considering or looking at when they're mapping that out. So what would you say about that? If somebody were to start a business and they were to say, okay, I'm going to set some sort of a deadline for, if it doesn't work by this time frame, then I'm going to pivot and move on again. Are they doing that based on resources that they have? Are they doing that based upon just some, random portion of time? Hey, it's going to be a year or 3 years or whatever the number is. How do they go about thinking about that? Do you talk about that in your book?
I don't explicitly talk about that in my book. However, I believe they should have a plan before they start. So they should have a market research and plan for a period of time. Usually that's 2, maximum 3 years, when they should assess and evaluate the possible outcome. So they should always have a plan for the best case scenario, like they really hit it hard. They should have a normal scenario that is more probabilistic, that their business will not skyrocket, but it will do fine. And they should also have a scenario for worst case. Yeah. So what they're gonna do if it doesn't work. So in my book, I have an example about a guy who opens a beer shop near office center where many companies have their offices, and nobody buys his beer, and he wonders why, because usually people after work are willing to drink a beer, yeah. And whatever the reason for that is, while trying to figure it out, he stays in the queue for 15 minutes to buy himself a coffee. So that's an aha moment in the book, when he should have actually closed his beer business and open a coffee business, because nobody drinks beer at work, yeah. And after work, people usually go home by car. So a coffee, in that case, a coffee shop might have been a much better alternative than a beer.
I actually think I do, because I did read some of your book. I don't know if you know that or not. I don't think I read it cover to cover, but I do remember reading about that in the book. That was an interesting point. Yeah.
Yeah, I try to bring it, as I said, as an aha moment, yeah, so that the reader also feels the pain of that entrepreneur. Entrepreneurship is always hard, yeah, and you might be stuck with your idea. This is one danger that I see. You are stuck with your idea and you think it's the best, but actually it's maybe not market fit.
It's not marketed, like somebody doesn't do a good job getting it out there.
No, what I mean is that it's not a good market fit. So it doesn't.
Oh, market fit. Okay,
fit.
I
Exactly.
gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
It's this classic example, I believe. What do you need in order to sell like crazy? So you need, for example, if you sell hot dogs, yeah, what's the main prerequisite that you win in your business? It's that you should have a starving crowd, yeah. And this is exactly the example that I had in my book. There was no starving crowd there for a beer, yeah. But people in the office center were always willing to have a coffee. So even if you are in the beer business and you like beer and you try to develop that idea, yeah, it just might be either at the wrong time or in the wrong place.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So those are two. Did you want to go through all of them, or do you want to just hit a couple of them, or?
I would like to hit one more, and that's probably pride. That is something really interesting, because that happens usually after we get success, yeah. So we are very often victims to hubristic pride, and this is something which will draw us back later on, yeah. So I would encourage, even after we have success, yeah, to stay humble, to control risk, and let discipline, not our ego, yeah, to protect what you build, because otherwise it's a very big chance we will ruin what we've built.
That's a really good point. And I know I said I was going to save this for the premium episode, and I'll probably delve into it a little bit more. But ironically, shortly before and even during, when I had the suspicion that my job might be going bye-bye, I continued after, a certain level of success and, a record year in 2025 and year to date in 2026 at the time, to treat myself a little bit. And luckily I built the solid financial foundation where everything is fine, but I did notice myself spending pretty, openly on certain things that I wanted. And since that time, and it's only been a very short time at the time of this recording, I've pulled back in a big, big way. And it just kind of speaks to, you could be on top of the world one day, and then all of a sudden your circumstances could change. So having that financial discipline, I think, is key. It's vital. It's crucial. And I think that a lot of people, myself included, going back to one of your original points, when you bring, it's not just the mathematical side, it's also the emotional side. And I've seen that play out firsthand, and it's just really interesting to me that, that's happened very recently. But so anyway, I just wanted to chime in with that.
Yeah, so as I said, in my opinion, the money game is very rarely an intellectual game or a mathematical game, although most of us believe so. First of all, it's always an emotional game.
Yep, we all act on emotion when it comes to personal finance, and that's part of the fun, honestly, too, I think, is, it's what makes personal finance personal. Everybody knows, what's the saying out there? If it was all about information, we would all be billionaires with six-pack abs or something like that, right? It's about execution, and what gets in the way sometimes of that execution or can morph or influence in some way, shape, or form that execution. I think emotions sit right there at the top. So, yeah, good stuff. Okay.
Yeah, I actually really like your idea with the six-pack. Everybody knows. Yeah, because everybody knows what they need to do to get a six-pack. It's not an information problem. It's a problem of consistency and a problem of getting out of your comfort zone and discipline. That's a pretty good example, actually, to compare gym with finance.
So what would you suggest for the listeners if they're like, all right, I feel like I'm still losing the money game. What types of things should I be doing or thinking about, or how do they approach that from a strategic standpoint of how do they win the money game?
Yeah, so I would recommend that people start budgeting. And when I say budgeting, it's a little bit opposite from common understanding that you should track every expense and put your bills in a spreadsheet and so on. You can do that, certainly, yeah, but very often that's a loss of time. So in my opinion, budgeting shall be forward-looking. So that means you've got your salary, yeah, if you're an employee, you've got your salary, and you plan ahead of the month where your money will go. So you put aside an amount of money that will go to your monthly expenses, another amount of money that will go into savings and or investing, and so on. So this is actually a very good trick in having a good compromise in all aspects of your life, because everybody nowadays talks about delayed gratification and so on. For sure, that's a strong concept. But I also want to live today. I don't want to live when I'm 60 years old. I would not have the energy any longer to travel around the world. Yeah?
Exactly.
So how to have the compromise about it? So in my opinion, this forward-looking budget is actually the response. I like going out with my buddies for a beer. Yeah. So I don't want to feel shamed or I don't want to feel guilty after doing that. So how then should I go about it? I should budget an amount of money that I will spend every month for going out with my buddies or for anything else which brings joy. Yeah. So in other words, yeah, enjoyment is also part of the budgeting, and that way every aspect of your life will find its place and will have an allocated money amount which will avoid any irrational or any spontaneous decisions which will simply destroy any system which you anyway don't have if you don't budget.
There's a book out there, I believe it's by T. Harv Eker. I want to say it's Secrets of the Millionaire Mind, which is one of my favorite books of all time. And he talks in that book, I think it was that book, about essentially compartmentalizing things, which is kind of, in essence, I think what you're kind of going for here. And he mentioned in one instance that you would have a separate account that you would decide ahead of time, kind of like you're talking about, forward thinking, forward looking, where you would put in a certain amount of money. But the thing is, you have to spend that money that month. You basically have to go out and blow it. But you also have these other accounts where you're doing your savings, you're doing your investing, you're making sure your bills and everything else is taken care of, so that when it comes time to say, all right, I have to blow the money in this account, you can feel really good about it. And it's not something where you're just hoarding all this money in one account and just kind of wrapping your arms very tightly around it, thinking that you can't let anything seep out because you're not allowed to have any fun at this point in life. And I think that kind of coincides with your example about the beer, right? Where you might do something where you say, hey, this money is going to be allocated for going out with my buddies and drinking some beers and having a good time. And I can feel good about that because I've made that plan in advance, right?
Yeah, exactly. And actually, you are totally right about his book. So actually, I didn't read his book, but I went to one of his seminars. So I believe he calls it a jar system, where you can imagine like different jars, and once you got your monthly paycheck, you distribute a money amount in each jar. And that's a very powerful idea that you mentioned. So if you have a jar, or you should have a jar for monthly joy, you should blow it up every month. That's actually a very powerful concept, because this will also help you avoid the other traps. Yeah, like you are over saving. Yeah, as you said, you shouldn't hoard everything. You also should live today, not just tomorrow.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that I think are starting, myself included, to come around and feel the same way. For anybody that's been in the FIRE, the Financial Independence Retire Early community for any length of time, there's the mad scientist in there. He finally came out, I believe his real name is Brandon Gaunch, and he was one that he had an extremely high savings rate, like a lot of people in the FIRE community. But he just came out with this site, and maybe we'll drop a link to it in the show notes or something. I believe it's called Wealth Machines. And the whole premise is, instead, like, it's okay to spend the money now. And I think he gave the example in one of his YouTube videos about, like, okay, what if you like to go to the lake? Or what if you like to go and ski? And your first thought is, when I go here, I really like this. I should buy a house on the lake. I should buy a house near a ski resort or whatever. And for some people, maybe that's the answer. But the other thing he talks about is, well, what if I just had this quote unquote wealth machine that spits off enough cash flow where I can essentially go, whatever it is, once a year, twice a year, whatever the case might be, and just stay somewhere really nice and rent it, and then not have to have the obligation and the ongoing costs and expenses and headaches and responsibility of owning the property there. And again, that's not the answer for everybody, but it's just about enjoying things now, and then having these, again, going back to the theme of being forward looking and strategic, having this quote unquote wealth machine that is designed strictly for that purpose. And so the purpose of that wealth machine is to generate cash flow in order to be used for that purpose. And once again, we're not waiting until we're too old or not physically able to go skiing or to enjoy ourselves on the lake or whatever the case might be, because we're working towards that now and giving essentially every dollar a purpose, if that makes sense. I think there's a lot of us that are starting to think differently. Even me as a financial advisor, I think about things differently. Back in the day, it was, oh, you always got to plan for the future and all that. And that's still important, don't get me wrong, but there's something to be said about having balance. And I think that's very, very important for people to understand, to the listeners, that if you're, you got to do what you got to do based on where you are. And there's different phases and seasons of life. And there's times where, like, you're just not going to get the time back. And so you need to enjoy it while you can, but still be responsible and take care of yourself in the future at the same time.
Yeah, very good point. And that's why I'm saying the budgeting is probably the best tool that anybody can start with in order to plan it that way. And an important message that I want the readers to, or the listeners to retain after the show, is that it's nothing wrong in spending money as long as you do it intentionally and not randomly. Yeah, there is nothing wrong to buy an expensive cell phone if you did that on purpose and saved maybe for it a couple of months, and not got impulsively because you saw there is some kind of a discount, or you just saw an ad and it drew your attention. Yeah. So as long as it is intentional, I believe it's fine.
Are there any tools that you use for this? I know of one in particular. I've looked at it. I've never personally used it. I know Cashflow Rockefeller Prince likes it, and maybe we'll put a link in the show notes. It's YNAB, You Need a Budget. And I think he has a referral link or something. I told him if we ever decided to put it in the show notes, I'd use his link. So shout out to you all. Send me your link and I'll put it in there. But Do you use any kind of tools or software or anything, or how do you map that out?
Yeah, so actually there's a free tool available on my website which replicates this jar system. So it's basically a forward-looking technique that you put your paycheck there, you put your fixed income or sorry your fixed expenses, and then you are able to allocate a percentage amount for different jars. Yeah, and it is calculating automatically how much you should put in every pocket, so to say. And on top of that, it's in my book where it is described what would be an appropriate medium for each of these jars. Yeah. So if, for example, you've got this um, fun jar that you should blow every month. Yeah. So that means a current account would do. You don't need to plan any interest on it because you anyway blow it up at the end of the month. So it doesn't make sense to think about interest rates on that account. However, if you are having, for example, um, long-term saving for spending account, means you are essentially saving money for a car, for example, yeah, then different medium would be appropriate for it, and most probably that would be government bonds, for example, yeah, because they're among the most secure instruments, yeah, and they are providing an interest rate. So that means you are kind of multiplying your money, not a high velocity, for sure not, yeah, but you trade that for the comfort of knowing that you will most certainly have your money when you need it. So it is also a powerful concept that you should plan for expenses, and you should have the target date and match the maturity of the bonds with the target date. I describe that in my book, and that's also how I recently did when I changed my car. So I've been saving in government bonds for about 3 years with a target maturity date in February when actually I changed my car. Yeah, for the record, for the record, it's still a used car, so I don't recommend buying new cars due to the devaluation, which occurs very fast.
Okay, I want to double click on that for a second. So first of all, if you don't mind us asking, you don't have to tell us, but just out of curiosity, what kind of vehicle did you get?
Oh, that's a Mercedes, 2019, so it's 7 years old.
Nice. Okay. So you're a fan of pre-owned vehicles versus new because of the depreciation.
Exactly, yeah. And I'm also a fan of premium segment, yeah, but used cars again. I would rather prefer a 7 years old Mercedes that I got instead of a brand new Renault, for example.
Okay.
Nothing against Renault.
I know a lot of people, that myself included. I used to have an Audi back in the day, and I bought it pre-owned. It was about 3 years old. It had, at the time I purchased it, it was like 17,000 miles on it. It came off of a lease. And that was probably one of my favorite cars. Very, very fun to drive. I'm sure Mercedes are fun to drive. I know a lot of people like BMWs. There's, different brands out there that people might be accustomed to. But I bought that car pre-owned, and there's a lot of people that when they look at certain types of cars, specifically German cars, they will kind of balk at the maintenance costs. So I guess, my question would be, how do you account for that? And obviously you can get a pre-purchase inspection and those sorts of things, but how do you think about, well, I'm going to buy it pre-owned because of the depreciation versus if I bought it new, it would depreciate a lot more quickly. But how do you counterbalance that with, well, this car likely will need more maintenance sooner, and that maintenance on these types of vehicles is generally very expensive. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's actually a good point, and I see many of my friends also thinking in that direction. But to be honest, think like this: every 5 years or 4 to 5 years, your car value or the price for your car is halving. So instead of buying a new Mercedes, you bought it at half the price. So that extra money that you saved yourself for buying it pre-owned, yeah, you will never have to invest so much in maintenance to that it will exceed your saving, if you get the point.
Okay, so buying it new versus pre-owned, the value gets cut in half roughly every 5 years or so. So because you essentially got the car at half off, even though the maintenance itself may be expensive and it may surface more quickly, you're not going to pay more in maintenance than that 50% savings anyway. Is that pretty much where you're going with that?
Yeah, exactly. And from my experience, around about 7 years, pre-owned cars might be actually the optimum, yeah, because they do not require that much maintenance yet because they are durable cars. I've been working in automotive industry for 10 years, and all the automakers are designing the cars for 15 years, so that's a standard requirement. And when you buy a car for 7 years, yeah, that means it's essentially just at the half of the calculated lifetime. So you still have a long way to go, but you save yourself a lot of money for not buying it brand new.
Okay. What about? I'm just this is interesting to me, and I bought a new car. So you're going to yell at me for that about a year ago, and this is right around the time I got rid of the Audi. I was actually looking at buying another Audi, and I was I guess I had thought about pre-owned again, but I kind of got burned, I think, with the one that I had. Ultimately, it didn't last nearly as long as I thought that it would. So I was looking at new, and then I thought, maybe I could get something that is a little bit more economical, got a family now, that sort of thing. And so I ended up buying a Honda, but I bought it brand new. And the price of that Honda was, I probably could have bought 2.5 of them for the price that I was going to pay for the new Audi. I guess my question I would pose is, how do you think about if you're buying a vehicle like a Honda or a Toyota or something else that generally speaking does not have a very high premium price tag? Does your opinion change at all on the new versus pre-owned, or would you still suggest to people they should generally look for pre-owned for the reasons that you mentioned?
Well, I would say that if you want to buy a Honda, buy it pre-owned, then you save even more money. The premium segment is just a preference of mine. Um, I have nothing against brands like Honda or Toyota. They're absolutely very nice cars. It's just a matter of comfort. But if you are considering to buy a Toyota, yeah, buy it pre-owned. Pre-owned. The same principle applies. Why not?
I guess. I don't know. I've had new vehicles. I've had pre-owned vehicles. I'm a big believer in if you're going to buy it and you're going to keep it for 10 plus years, which is usually my intention, then at least in this particular case, I went ahead and I purchased it new, and hopefully it'll last me for a very, very long time. And there was a time, and I don't want to get too hung up on this topic, but just interesting while we're talking about it, during COVID especially, where, that's probably an outlier exception, but a lot of cases it actually was cheaper or less expensive to buy a new vehicle if you could find one versus pre-owned. And that might just be kind of an off-the-wall thing that doesn't happen under normal circumstances. But anyway, just an observation there, I guess.
Yeah, interesting. Never heard of that, yeah, but probably that was an off-the-wall exception.
All right. So let's see. Where do you want to take the conversation next?
So I would like to take the conversation about the key money principles, as I call them. So that would be some aspects of financial life that we all go through, and there are some essential things that maybe we can understand about them. So I'm talking about earning, saving, spending, and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So I believe the first thing that everybody should understand is earning. Yeah, because this is actually where wealth begins, so to say. Yeah, if you don't earn anything, then it's no way you can make a fortune, right? So there is a concept in my book that I describe, or I call as earning metrics. And what I'm saying is that there are 4 ways that anybody can earn money, and that's being the employee, which probably most of the people are. That means you essentially trade your time and skills, but essentially your time for money because you're paid for hour. Then there's the transition to self-employed, where that's not necessarily tied to your time, but rather to your skills, because you are delivering a clear output. It depends on how it is arranged, for sure, yeah, but more often than not, it's based on deliverable and not on the time spent. Then the next level would be business owner, and here is an important distinction that I would like to make between a solopreneur and entrepreneur, yeah, because many so-called businesses are actually disguised solopreneurs who are doing everything by themselves, yeah, and
Yep.
they are still calling it a business. Yeah? So in order to be a true business, it should have systems, it should have frameworks, and ideally it should work even if you get outside of it, yeah. And last but not least, there is the last item in the quadrant, which would be the investor. So that means you are actually leveraging capital. Business is more leveraging people, while investing is more leveraging capital. And an important thing I would like to say about this earning matrix is that it is not like a hard cut between one area to the other. Basically, you could be in more areas at once. You could be employed, work for a salary, and still have a side hustle where you are delivering some services and earning extra cash, while at the same time investing the extra cash. So you are also in the investing quadrant, you know. So that's an interesting perspective to look at earning money.
It sounds really similar to like essentially the quadrants from like Rich Dad Poor Dad Robert Kiyosaki.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of what we're talking about here? Like the ESBI, E for employee, S for self-employed small business, B for big business owner, and I for investor. It's kind of a similar principle, right?
It's kind of similar. What I don't like about how he describes it, it's that he says a business should have like minimum 500 employees, if I'm not wrong. But I think this has nothing to do with the number of employees. For any investor among us, we know the company Realty Income, and if I'm not wrong, it has 393 employees, or it had at the last time I checked it, and it still earns billions. Yeah, so it's not necessarily tied to the number of employees. This is something which I bit kind of disagree with Robert.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people that would disagree with different things that he says. Especially, it seems like as time goes on, he just kind of gets more and more off the wall. But anyway, okay. So you have the quadrants, and you can be in multiple quadrants at the same time. Okay, and that's something that I think a lot of us are. I mean, even if you're an employee and then you're also investing in whatever you're investing in. But I know a lot of people like to talk about real estate investing. We talk about that on this show sometimes. You could be in the E and the I quadrant at the same time. And like the example you gave with the side hustle, you can be, essentially the E, S, and the I quadrants all at the same time. So, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the next big aspect of our financial lives is spending. We've talked about it a little bit, but I would like to emphasize a concept that I described in my book, which I call the price value curve. So essentially, low priced items tend to have low quality, and there is a perception that if you buy low quality items, you probably will spend more because you have to replace them more often. Yeah, and that is totally true. It can really happen. Then once you move a little bit more to medium priced items, the value that you get rises exponentially. Yeah, so you increase a little bit the price that you pay, but you double or triple the benefit or the endurance of the item that you buy. What's interesting is that if we then move even more in increasing the price, then the value we get is actually caping. Yeah, so the curve flattens. You pay more, but the value you get is actually not increasing proportionally. Yeah, so at this time you already start paying for brands or paying for other sort of things just to show off.
Gotcha. Yeah. So essentially, you don't want to buy the cheapest thing out there because you're probably going to have to replace it a whole bunch, and you're going to spend more money cumulatively doing that. But you don't necessarily have to spend all the money on the most expensive thing, because at some point you're just paying a premium price for something that's really not delivering that much value. The sweet spot's probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, exactly. And while we are speaking about this, I actually realized that matches pretty nicely to the car discussion that we got previously. Yeah.
Okay.
So if you get new Mercedes, then you have to pay a lot more of a lot more money. Yeah, because it's a brand new car. But if you are buying it pre-used, like 5 years, 6 years, or 7 years, as I said, it's optimum. Then you get actually almost the same thing, yeah, because it's the car does not degrade that much in the first 7 years, yeah. So you still get a pretty nice car, but at a price which is much cheaper. So I realized it actually matches interestingly with this value curve principle.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I just randomly here, while I'm thinking of this, we went back to the Mercedes thing. What's your general opinion on people leasing vehicles?
Leasing vehicles. Oh, that can do, but my preference is to own it, because then you can do whatever you want. So in case something hits you hard and you have the car, then you just can keep it. Yeah, there are people who are driving 20 years old cars, yeah, without having to replace them. Yeah, for sure there is some maintenance work to be done, but they are still driving them. While leasing it, it's kind of not in your pocket.
Gotcha. I was just curious your opinion. I know a lot of people's their opinion. I'm typically a fan of owning, but I know there are some situations. I listened to a podcast recently. I think it was the Main Street Business podcast, and they were talking about actually two different ways to do expense mileage. If you took actual expenses versus if you took the standard rate, and then they got into this whole discussion about buying versus leasing, and if you're a business owner. And so beyond the scope of our conversation today, but a lot of people are of the opinion that if you can have the majority towards business expenses, then in some cases it can make sense to lease. In other cases, maybe not. But yeah, I was just curious to get your thoughts. I think most people would probably agree that in general, for most drivers out there, purchasing the vehicle is probably going to make more sense in most cases. So
Yeah, so am I. Yeah, I'm also adept of owning it. In case you have a business and that is tax deductible, if there are any tax advantages depending on where you are and the tax regulations, then that's certainly another discussion. Yeah? But if we are talking about personal finance here, then I'm definitely an adept of owning the car.
agreed. Okay, very good.
An essential aspect of our financial lives is budgeting, which we actually touched already. What I would like to emphasize maybe once again here is that we should define these different jars, like different pockets that we put the money in. The percentage that we put there is actually are actually completely up to us. So there is no key recipe how to do it. It's up to you. But the thing which we need to understand is that there are different vehicles appropriate for different jars. Yeah. So if you want to save for a house, then probably bonds will do. I used the example with the car in the past. Yeah, but it's also working maybe if you're saving money for an apartment, for a house. And in that case, because you need the money, what's important to understand is to use low risk assets. This is why we talked about bonds, yeah, and what we did not emphasize is because they are considered less risky assets. When we are talking about an account for financial freedom, for example, yeah, then here we can afford to use high risk vehicles that are bringing high return potential. So that means we don't need the money for our living or for living our dreams, so to say. Yeah, that means we can afford more risk. And essentially, the shorter the term when we need the money, the less risk we can take. The longer the term until we need the money, the more risk we can take, because there is more time for the loss to eventually recover. So this is an important concept that I wanted to highlight in the context of budgeting and choosing appropriate jars with different risk grades.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that just, an example of that obviously being retirement plans. If somebody is presumably decades away from retirement, they can generally afford to have those funds invested in higher risk assets versus if it's something you're going to need in a couple years for a car or a down payment on a house, like you mentioned, you're going to want to match the vehicle and the risk profile appropriately to the time frame and the goal for what the money is. So that makes sense. Yeah. So people are going to have different types of accounts and for different goals, different reasons, and those accounts are going to be structured differently and likely, hopefully, be invested in things that are appropriate and matched up with those respective time frames.
Yeah, exactly. But a key concept is that the longer the term, the more risk you can take. Yeah, in the book I actually bring a couple of examples regarding different assets which would be suitable for different jars. Yeah, and talking about risk and perhaps debt, because we touched upon the housing, yeah, and down payment for housing. That would be one of the next key aspects of our financial lives, and we should not avoid debt, in my opinion. So I've seen adepts who are saying you should avoid debt at any cost, which I don't think is right. Yeah, and I also see people who use debt like crazy for very risky affairs. I think Robert Kiyosaki is one of them. If you've ever read them,
Yeah, yeah, he loves it.
I think, yeah, he loves it, but I think that's simply insane. Yeah. So in my opinion, there is good debt, bad debt, and dangerous debt. So good debt would certainly be something which you take for good reasons, so to say, like a housing. I think that would be the best example. And quite often it happens that instead of saving the money for down payment, it's actually more convenient to take the loan and repay it in advance. Yeah, I've got friends who were not comfortable with taking any debt, so they were saving money for an apartment, for a house, or whatever, and they're still saving, believe me, after years, because the prices went high so much that they simply cannot keep the pace.
Yeah, part of it is locking in the price. And like you said, you could always prepay the loan or start to prepay the loan if you wanted to, versus just letting the prices are generally, if they're saving, like we were talking about a little while ago, if they were saving in a vehicle that's low risk and ostensibly low return, but the prices continue to increase at a much faster rate, that kind of speaks exactly to your point of prices are going to continue to climb and run up on them faster than they can save and grow that cash pile to get into that property, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the most funny things out of a friend that I'm telling the story about now is that actually he lives in rent. So he saves money while paying for rent. It makes no sense because the monthly paying for a mortgage is actually on the same level as paying for a rent. It's
Yeah, but what about, let me push back a little bit here. Like, what about the fact that he can pay the same monthly payment, but as far as his obligation in the event something goes wrong for repairs or maintenance or just having the flexibility to pick up and move if he wanted to after the lease is out, assuming he has a lease, doesn't that have value too?
that has a value too, for sure. And the way I see it, in order to find the best fit, so my opinion is certainly on taking the loan or taking a mortgage, for housing, but it shouldn't be more that you can possibly repay in 10 years. So that is how I've got my apartment a couple of years ago. So when I've got it, I also got a loan, and I calculated in the way that I would be able to repay it completely in 10 years. So in the end, I repaid it actually in 6 years. So I did a good job here. And when I would compare the extra money that I paid as interest to the bank for the loan, that's round about 15% over the acquisition price, but during these 6 years, the housing actually doubled. So I like to think that I won much more than I lost by paying the interest to the bank. Or the other way to see it is actually the bank did a very poor deal with me because they would be better off buying the apartment themselves.
I guess. I mean, yeah, the bank, but they don't want to own the real estate. Can I ask, on the loan that you looked at, the 10-year loan, is that common? I'm assuming, are you in the U.S.? I'm not even sure if you're.
Oh no,
No.
I'm based in Europe.
Europe, okay. So the loan products and structures, I would imagine, are probably quite a bit different, right? Like there's no 30-year fixed loan there, is there?
No, you can take it for how much time you would like, and you can repay at any time you wish. And there it is, special loans for houses, essentially mortgages, and when you repay in advance, you are not charged any commission. So for any other type of loan, you are charged a commission when you repay it, but not for mortgages.
But as far as the rate itself, will they only lock, like how long will a bank lock the fixed rate? Will they only do fixed for 10 years and then it's variable? Is that why you try to make sure that it can be paid in a maximum of 10 years?
No, they usually lock it for 7 years. 10 years was a personal target. So
I gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious now on this. So if they lock it for 7 years, presumably they have some sort of upper limit to how high that rate can adjust and how quickly that can happen after the 7 years, right? Or can they just do whatever they want?
Yeah, I believe they can do whatever they want, but I think there's a good thing that we can do in anticipating the bank. So the bank will give you a better deal. Yeah, no, the bank will give you the deal that is better for them. So you should take the other deal. Yeah. So in my case, I've got a variable loan which went down a lot during COVID, and I was essentially paying pennies back to the bank. Unfortunately, I wasn't smart enough at the time to refinance it at a fixed rate when the rates were very low. But I've got an uncle who did this. So he was refinancing his mortgage at 1.6%, which is record low in Europe.
Gotcha.
So
okay.
He still actually pays the mortgage, and I understand why, because he still has that 1.6% locked in. For him, there is no reason to have any advanced repayment.
I think you put that in the book, didn't you? I thought I saw 1.6 in the book. Okay.
It's in the book, exactly.
Yeah, we locked it. I'm in the U.S. here. We locked during that time. I refinanced at 2.99 for 30 years. If you had the option, just out of curiosity, if you had the option there to take out a 30-year fixed loan and rates were reasonable, would you do it, or would you still stick to the I want to have this paid in 10 years or less?
This is a classic problem of repayment versus investment. I would do both, because the market is uncertain, and also future life, everything is uncertain. I would repay both. So I described this actually also in my book, and the approach that I suggest is that you pay, or you use the extra cash that you have for repaying proportionally with the interest rate of the loan and with the interest rate, or the eventual or possible gaining rate on the market. So
yeah,
let me give
I think you put that in the book. There was like 3 different sections. It was like below a certain percent, between this and this, and over, I think you might have put 10. Is that what you were going to say?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I'll let you go through it. Go ahead.
So you can pay both, but allocate a different amount of money. So let's say you have 1% to pay on your loan, which is very, very low, but the stock market can yield you 8% annually, based on long-term statistics. And that is actually a quite conservative estimation. So that means you can actually use your extra cash to pay just a tiny amount, like 1% of your extra cash, to pay for loan repayment, and The other percentage, like 7% of the extra cash to pay for, or to invest actually in the stock market. Yeah, this way you do both. Yeah, but you are not taking any wrong decisions, so to say. Yeah?
So explain that again. The 1% versus the 7%. You're saying if you had 8% excess, you could allocate it and say of the 8% excess amount that I have this month, I'm going to take the majority of it, 7% of it, and invest it, and I'm going to take a little bit of it, 1% of it, and prepay the debt. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Because there is actually no point in repaying 1% interest rate. It's actually for free. Yeah? 1% interest rate is nothing when compared to the 8% that the stock market can yield. But in order to achieve both, yeah, in order to not have like left or right decision only, you can do this proportional allocation. That's how I see it.
I gotcha. Okay. And there's a lot of people that will, I mean, usually they're not as mathematical about it. They'll just say, hey, I have an extra, whatever, $100. I'm going to take half of it, invest it, and half of it, and pay down this debt, depending on what it is. And people do different things. But I think, you know, a lot of people want to have that same feeling of like, I'm not making a wrong decision. And even if there's one that's mathematically more optimal than the other, emotionally, they still feel like they're accomplished and accomplishing things by splitting it up in whatever proportion they want and doing both at the same time.
Yeah, I've done this for the last couple of years when I still had the mortgage, and it paid out pretty well, I would say. It worked out very well.
I could see why people would do that. Personally, my mindset on this is a little bit different. I'm kind of an all or nothing type of guy. So a lot of the loans that we have are mortgages, and those rates, most of them are very, very low. They're fixed. And so I'm usually not in a rush to prepay any of that stuff, but I would much rather take the funds and invest it. And I guess I could split it up a little bit or allocate it proportionally. That's not something that I've historically done. And I think a lot of that has to go back to essentially risk tolerance and risk capacity too, right? Everybody's going to feel differently about it, but just because you could split it up for the individual, for the listener, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do one or the other or both. You can do whichever one makes you more comfortable. And in taking it a step further, even though mathematically it may not make sense to pay off, I think you use the example of a 1% interest rate, and I would agree with that. There's some people that no matter what, they're just not going to feel comfortable investing that money. They want to get the debt paid, even though it's not the quote unquote mathematically correct decision. That's what makes personal finance personal. There's also, going back to the beginning of the show, the emotional component that we have to account for at the same time, right? So
yeah, for sure. So this is certainly not a financial advice. Yeah, it's just a tip on how people could do it.
Yeah.
But the emotional comfort has a price of its own, for sure. It has different value for each people. You mentioned pretty well the concept of risk tolerance and risk capacity, and I think this is a thing of risk tolerance. Some people simply are not comfortable in taking risks, so they don't sleep well at night if they still have a loan.
Agreed. Yep. Yeah, and obviously we don't give any advice on the show, like you said. This is for entertainment, for education. People can do whatever they want to do. Consult your own professional if you need to, and kind of roll on from there. So.
Yeah, everybody's situation is unique, so there is no universal recipe.
Got it. Okay. What else did we miss? Anything?
Well, what we miss, and I think it's really important to mention it, is protection. So we're talking much about investing and about different ways to spend money and so on. But protection is actually also one thing that we need to keep in mind. So probably it's become a cliche, yeah, but everybody of us should have an emergency fund. It's really important. So guys, before starting investing, I believe you should first have an emergency fund, yeah, like a cushion that you will rely with in case the things get bad. Bad times are always happening when we expect them the least.
Agreed 100%. Going back to what I said earlier, just to interject here for a second, and I'll probably talk more about this on the premium show I do on it, but yeah, I had just bought some fairly expensive items, and then the hammer got dropped, and then all of a sudden something went wrong with one of the rentals, and then we have another one that they're not on track for rent payment, and it's one thing. When it rains it pours, as they say, and so you need to make sure that you're in a position to weather the storm when the inevitable storm comes for each and every one of us, because it will happen at some point. And, rather than stress about it, you kind of just throw your hands up sometimes, and I just chuckle and say, yep, that sounds about right. Of course that happened now. Of course, our dog needs to go to the vet. Of course, this is all going to happen at the same time, because that's just how it works. But anyway, protection, huge piece. I'll let you continue with that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so essentially you need to put your feet put your feet strongly in the ground before you can make any running. So the emergency fund is the most essential for it. There are certainly more ways of protection, like income protection, health protection in terms of insurance, life insurance also, fraud and identity protection using two-factor authentications for your broker platform and so on. But an important thing which is, I think, worth discussing is diversification. So diversification is also a way to protect. And interesting, while discussing this and remembering the example with the loan repayment and or versus investing, that's also a kind of diversification when I was recommending doing both. So whatever the market does or whatever the life is doing, you actually have a diversification because you repaid a little bit of both. So when you're considering investing, don't put all your eggs in one basket. That's, I think, a famous saying, and that's exactly about diversification. So invest in different stocks, or even more, you can also invest in different vehicles. So you do not need to necessarily stick only to the stock market. You can also buy bonds, you can also buy real estate. All of them are compatible. You can have a broad portfolio with different asset classes, and I believe this is actually what everybody should do, because when one asset does poorly, the other might actually do pretty well. And I think a very good example would be with gold. Gold did a very good job this year in times of uncertainty.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. I was actually reading an article from one of the real estate syndicators. They run a debt fund, and they do private credit, and I'll skip all that for now on this. But the article, they were talking about, essentially as a 60-40 portfolio debt, right? Historically, your textbook moderate portfolio is likely, at least in traditional public markets, going to be something like 60% equities or stocks and 40% bonds or fixed income. And they kind of went through this conversation and discussion of like, well, but what happens with an interest rate environment like we've had? And what would happen if instead of the 40% being traditional fixed income, you had other types of assets like real assets in there, like you mentioned about real estate and different exposure to real assets that you can get, or even gold and other commodities. And so it was just really interesting to to take a look at that. But I would agree that everybody needs to take a look at their own situation and assess it, but come up with a portfolio that is balanced enough and diversified enough where it makes sense for the individual. And sometimes, and the article talks a little bit about this, sometimes that involves substitutions in some ways. And a small example of this that I'll give here in my own personal portfolio is the fact that in traditional public markets, I am nearly 100% equities, which on the surface seems extremely aggressive, and it is. And, some people would say that that's extremely risky in some ways too. But going back to our earlier conversation, when you're matching up different vehicles and investment styles with the time frame that funds are needed, well, maybe it's not all that risky after all. But where I was going with the substitution method is the way that I view part of our real estate portfolio is I almost sort of look at that as a substitution for bonds, specifically the rental properties, right? Well, why do people buy bonds? Well, they might buy them for different reasons. Usually there's a component of stability, there's a component of income, or that they want to drive in the form of interest payments, and just to overall be balanced when certain parts of the portfolio go up, like you just mentioned. Other parts may decline, and it kind of offsets it a little bit, except for times like 2008 where everything went down, but that's a separate story. But it's one of those things where I look at it and say, okay, well, if I want stability and I want income, is there a way for me to do that and use something as a substitute for fixed income or bonds, where personally, and this is a personal bias of mine, and I'm not saying people should agree with me or not, or should or shouldn't do this, but in a medium term to long term, especially long term portfolio, I am a much bigger fan of incorporating more and more real assets and less fixed income. That's what works for me personally. That doesn't mean that's going to work for everybody, but just talking about, and that article started to go through different characteristics of what if your typical 40%-ish of fixed income, assuming somebody was a moderate investor, and again, that's not going to be for everybody. What if you used other types of asset classes, including real assets? Does that change anything? And I'm not going to get into all the nitty gritty. You can look up different articles about it. But in a lot of cases, you actually can increase the return and in some cases reduce the volatility at the same time. And everybody always jokes about, well, I want to make as much money as possible with the least amount of risk. And it's like, yeah, well, who doesn't? But at the end of the day, there are sometimes ways to do that. There's no free lunch, and there's different things you need to be aware of. But that's just something that I have a personal bias towards, and everybody's going to have their own personal biases about what asset classes they like or not. But at the end of the day, having some sort of diversification across the either all asset classes or the ones that resonate with the individual is definitely important. I wouldn't be, all in one or all in another. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So I agree with what you're saying about diversification, and I think there's different ways to get there. And I'm a big fan, if you can't tell, of real estate and real assets, and even started to buy some silver, believe it or not. I know it's not gold, poor man's gold, they say, but that was something that also had moved quite a bit in value.
Yeah, actually, I've seen diversification being called the only free lunch in finance sometimes.
That's true, and you got to, there was something recently too about concentrate, and I don't know if I agree or disagree with this. I have mixed feelings about this, but concentration for a lot of people is the path to wealth, and diversification is the path to maintain wealth. But I think there's some truth to that, but when you dig a little bit deeper and you realize, well, wait a minute, if concentration is the path to wealth, on the other side of that, when it doesn't go well, is it also the path to ruin? Because, people say you only got to get rich once. Okay, fine, maybe. But at the same time, is that person taking inordinate amounts of risk at the potential trade-off of, it could go to ruin, and they may not have the chance to diversify later on. But their point was basically like, you can't diversify your way to wealth. But I think if you put certain systems and habits in place, like we've talked about here today, I think it's hard to go wrong. And I think diversification is something that most people, if not everybody, should at least strongly consider. But there's a lot of people that will, start a small business of some kind and pour all their money and all their time and all their energy and all their effort, and they won't invest in anything outside of that until it gets to a certain point. And when things go well, you can build a lot of wealth that way. But if and when they don't, that's a pretty tough pill to swallow, I would say. So,
yeah, it's an interesting dilemma, diversification versus concentration. But one thing about concentration, it's possible to get rich quickly, but it's much more likely that you will get poor quickly.
Exactly.
And actually, one thing I wanted to emphasize with what you said, I totally resonated with your approach regarding real estate versus bonds. So I would certainly replace bonds with real estate when it comes to fixed income. So whenever I want fixed income, I go to real estate. But bonds, from my perspective, are more suitable when you need money on a certain date, because I don't want to sell a piece of real estate, an apartment, for example, when I need the money for some expenses. But I can sell bonds at any time. So I never invest in bonds for fixed income. Just for the target maturity date that I can get my money, and throughout all this time, my money didn't stay without working.
Well said. Yeah. No, I agree with that. And I think a lot of people are starting to challenge the traditional 60-40 model anyway. That's something that's been talked about for quite some time. I was actually kind of surprised to see that particular private real estate group fund had put out that article, because I feel like we've been reading about and hearing about is the 60-40 dead for years, and everybody has their own slant on it. It's like, well, if somebody's in alternative investments in traditional markets, then they're going to use that to plug their stuff. And if they're, a private equity person or private placements in the real estate space, they're going to use that to plug their, their debt fund instead of traditional bonds. And so, but you have to match it to the time frame. And it's cool to see that we agree on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, I believe these were the 6 aspects of the money game, yeah, the 6 principles, how I call them, that I touch upon the book and wanted to mention also here. Yeah, the rest is going into investing. So once we understand all these principles, we can start making our first steps, and this is what I encourage everybody to do. So reading and listening to shows is not sufficient. Start investing, do your own mistakes, learn from them, look forward, and eventually you will achieve stability and maybe financial freedom also. It's what I'm always telling to my friends: you don't need to be the investor of the year, yeah, but you need to get started and you need to put your money at work. Even if you don't have the most optimum portfolio or you didn't beat S&P 500, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you moved and your money worked for you.
Absolutely. I agree with that 100%. Yeah, you don't need to have the perfect portfolio or get too caught up in the nitty gritty. It's all about taking action. And depending on what somebody is investing in, we talk sometimes on the show about real estate syndication. You just got to keep swinging. You got to keep having at-bats, and you don't necessarily have to swing for the grand slam every time. Sometimes singles and doubles will work just fine. They still get the runs coming in. So and there are going to be times where things go south and you could potentially lose money, and unfortunately that is part of investing. But you want to make sure, going back to the beginning of the show, that you're not artificially making decisions that cause you a loss when you have control over those investments out of fear, right? You don't want to hit the sell button just because something went down a little bit. You want to be able to know what you own, why you own it, and what your plan is for when you entered into that investment. And there's other investments on the private side, in the private markets, that are more illiquid and you have less control after you write the check or wire the money. And in those instances, there's good and bad parts of that, and we'll save that for another show. But yeah, it's important to get started and, like you said, learn from your mistakes and just put some money to work. And sometimes when you have money invested in something, it's going to force you to pay attention to it, and it's going to be a learning experience. And if nothing else, it'll be tuition. So
yeah, there is no way you can build wealth if your time is tied to your money. So you need to detach your time from the money you earn, and investing, it's a good way to do that.
Exactly. There's a phrase out there, and so I don't know who to give credit to. This is not something I came up with, but it really resonated with me. It was, capital compounds, labor doesn't. And I think that perfectly sums up what you just said about getting your money to work for you and not tying that to your time.
Didn't hear that saying before, but yeah, it's exactly about that.
Yeah. Well, very good, Alex. We appreciate you coming on the show. I'm going to make sure to put a link to the book in the show notes. I think you also have a website with some different calculators on there that you mentioned. I think the book also has links, and I want to say I saw a couple QR codes in there as well that will link over to that, but we'll try to put that in the show notes as well so people can easily access that. And hopefully everybody takes some time to at least skim and go through some of the information in there, because it's really good stuff. So before I let you go and we wrap up, are any last thoughts or things you want to share with the listeners today?
Yeah, maybe just a few words why it is free. So the book is free, and there are plenty of tools referenced which are also accessible free. And the reason for that is that I want to share with people information that I wish I knew like a decade ago. And also, I honestly believe these things should be taught in school, but they aren't. So yeah, this is my contribution out of years of research. I wish people start having better financial lives.
Yeah, very good. No, I agree with that. And it's probably a separate show as well, but I think that more and more financial literacy stuff should be taught in schools. Unfortunately, it's not. And then you have a lot of people that get into adulthood and then realize, whoops, I shouldn't have done this or that, or I wish I knew this or that. And so this is a great resource for people to get themselves up to speed no matter where you are on your financial journey. We appreciate you coming on the show. Thanks. With that, we will see everybody in the next episode.
Thank you very much, Casual Thing. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for coming on.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.